Becky. Hi, everybody. My name's Steve. I'm codependent.
Thanks, Steve.
And I am just going to go ahead and get a few things ready here. Just need a second to prep. I have some stuff prepared for you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys all see that okay? So what I'm going to talk about today is step 6 and 7. And it's called 6 and 7, the path to authenticity. And the reason I chose this topic is I wanted to find a way to really talk about how important these steps are to me. They get called the forgotten steps, and I think they get called that for a couple of different reasons. Number one is that it's easy to kind of go through the steps and just blow through these in the first time pass. But also it's easy to get into the steps and start working them, and years into this, kind of forget about these steps and they kind of fall away. And for me, there's been times when they just don't, feel like a big part of my recovery, and I'm going to meetings and I'm talking about and doing all those things, but am I really, you have to step back and say, am I really doing these things? Am I really practicing them in my life? Am I really putting them into practice? And so today I have this broken down into a couple different parts. The first part, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and how these things came to fruition, these character defects, right, as part of my story, and my two recoveries that have sort of become one recovery, as Jackie alluded to. And then the second part of this is really about 6 and 7 and how I work them in my life, and hopefully how I can, potentially help someone here to work it in your life as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So my story. So I grew up as kind of a scared kid. Everything to me was fearful rather than exciting. I kind of, at an early age, something turned in me, and my parents even told me that I was this really happy kid. And then all of a sudden, something happened, and I kind of went into this different mode. And I think what that mode was just a lot of different kinds of fear. And I looked around and I saw people around me, and I really truly felt that they had gotten the instructions to life and that I didn't. And somewhere along the line, I missed the instructions. And how did I miss those instructions? And I started to compare myself to people, and I started to wish that I had what they had. And there were some things that I learned along the way. And I just want to preface this by saying that, as I start this, I'm going to talk about things that I picked up, and I picked them up along the way, some from family, but not all. A lot of times in CoDA, we talk about our family of origin and picking things up that way. But these are going to be things that are not just family of origin. They're also from, society, and the different messages that I get in the various ways. So growing up, I learned that it was really important to worry about things. That was one of the early messages that I got, is if you don't worry about something, it will get behind you and it will get you. But if you can get in front of it and worry about it, then you can do something to take care of it, that you can do something about it. I learned that it was important to look good physically, that if I looked good physically, that I would get attention from people, and that can be translated into love. I would get love from others, right? And the times when I didn't look as good physically, I didn't get the attention and I didn't get the love. And then there were times when I was working out, looking better, and I did. And so I learned that, if I work out, if I look good physically, I'll get that attention. And I've kind of learned in CoDA that translates into getting love. And I learned that it was important to be loved, and it was important to be successful, right? And these are the messages that not only did I get from home and watching, my dad, who was super successful in business, but all the messages that I get today, right? I can turn on the television. I'm a big NFL fan, and I turn on the TV now, and I'll get the messages that, Tom Brady is the most successful person in the world because he's been in 10 Super Bowls and he's won 7 of them. And because he has a supermodel wife, or used to. I think they're getting divorced. And that I have to be that person in order to have success in my life. A big one for me, and I don't exactly know where this came from, is that I learned that I needed to be intelligent. That intelligence was a big deal. And I work in a field today where intelligence is a really big deal. And the people that are looked up to in the business that I'm in are those who are intelligent. And those kind of became the people who had what I wanted, so to speak. I learned that it was important to win, to be admired, to be respected. I needed to win, and win whatever that is, right? If I'm playing a game, if whatever it is, right? In business, to be a success, and all these things start to go hand in hand. And I think you get the idea that these were kind of the messages that I was brought up with and continued to get. Um, I was brought up as an only child, so I felt a great deal of attention. And attention became a stressor to me. It wasn't a good thing. I see some people today and they like the attention, they thrive under the pressure. And I became more of a person that would, I please don't show me any special attention. And yet I wanted it. I wanted to be important. I wanted to be all those things listed above, but the attention became more of a stressful thing. And as I said, I always compared myself to others and felt less than, and as if I didn't know kind of what I was doing, and somehow they did. And that, I brought that into recovery with me. And as I said, these messages are, they can be family of origin, but they can come from a number of different places as well. So the way that I sort of dealt with these things was to drink and to quit. Those were kind of my two MOs: was I'll drink and I'll quit. And so I got into sports in high school, earlier than high school, but high school is when I really started to notice that I didn't get the instructions, more so than ever. And I looked around and people were doing really well. I played a lot of soccer as a kid, and I got on the soccer team in high school, and it was a different story. And all of a sudden the fear kicked in, and I had a friend say to me years later, he said, "We can never figure out, you were so good in practice, and then in the game you would just be different." And that's when that fear would kick in for me, and I just couldn't handle the pressure. It was just too much for me. And so I never started in high school. And so at some point, I think it was sophomore year, I decided, well, you know what? I know how I handle this. I'll just quit the team, right? And then quitting the team led to, other things, right? What am I going to do to replace that? And I started to drink, and I discovered alcohol. I discovered alcohol at the age of 14, and I drank for 10 years. And during that time, I found that what drinking did for me was that it took away a lot of these feelings, right? All these feelings of fear, all these feelings, all the things that I talked about on the previous slide were taken care of, the minute I got a few drinks in me. So I continued to do that. And the majority of my drinking was only about 4 years in college. But it allowed me to kind of become the person that I thought I wanted to be, right? So I grew my hair long, I was playing guitar, and I built this image, this social image, this social mask, and, tried to hide all the other stuff and continue drinking. And I hit bottom very quickly because of that. I hit bottom earlier on than most people that I see coming into AA. And I think it was just because so many things happened so quickly. Things escalated so fast for me. And my bottom was, a series of events of losing a relationship, getting a DWI, losing my job, having to sell my car, getting kicked out of my apartment, all in about a month's time. And so my hit bottom in December of 91. It was about a 2-month bottom. And I ended up getting sober in January 92, and I've been sober ever since. And when I came into AA, I brought myself, right? I got sober now, so now the alcohol is gone, but now I've brought myself into sobriety. And so initially, I blamed everyone for my problems. And, I felt like this, if this was different, if you were different, if you treated me differently, I would be okay. I wouldn't have these problems in my life. And fortunately, I had some really good sponsorship early on. And my second sponsor took me through, and we did a couple of 4th and 5th steps. We did 2 or 3 of them. And by the second or third one, I kind of learned about these character defects. And I think this is key to sort of understand where these things come from. And I discovered pride, ego, envy, fear, and resentments, and how they were driving me and how they were blocking my relationship with my higher power. And that was sort of my first taste of, it's not about everyone else. It's about me. It's about me. And so through that process, over the next, probably 10 years of my sobriety, I learned to treat others really well and to look at my part first. And that was really important. That was kind of my initial, way of getting better and treating people well. And, but my sponsor kind of warned me that, of all these defects, the one you're going to need to watch out for, and I really remember him saying this very specifically, was being hard on yourself, being tough on yourself. And, that's the one that, he was correct. I really brought that into my recovery, and it's kind of stuck around and shows up in a number of different ways. And after some time, I was about 10 years sober, and I was sitting at my old home group. I remember the meeting. It was on a Sunday night. Sunday night, it was a step meeting. It was a speaker step kind of thing. And I remember sitting there. I remember exactly where I was sitting at that very moment very clearly. And I remember thinking that, you know, over this time, I've learned how to treat people really well. I know how to treat others. I'm not acting out. I'm not really, getting my mouth's not getting me in trouble. I'm not shooting off emails. I'm not really creating a lot of chaos externally. But I am still left with all these feelings of fear. And I know how to sound in meetings. I know how to say the right things. And I felt like I sounded a lot better than I felt. And so I realized that this was going to be an internal journey for me, that maybe it might not be so much that, I'm going to be making amends all the time, although I do, not all the time, but, that it would be more about the internal journey, that something was missing on the inside and something needed to change on the inside. So, I spent the last 20 years then in recovery, the next 20 years trying to work on that, and 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 how to become, less fearful by relying on my higher power, and looking at, the ways I was beating myself up and trying to kind of move away from those things. And I tried a lot of different things. Number one is I'm trying to apply, the AA program, which worked well, but I still felt like there were some things missing. And so around that time, I got married, and my wife and I would go out to the stores. Sometimes we would go out to Barnes and Noble, and we would look for books and videos, and we would find these self-help types of books and videos, and we would spend time, watching them and talking about them, and praying on them, meditating, and they did offer some form of relief. They did help to some extent, but I always felt like I was still kind of had my A program over here, and I've got this self-help stuff over here. And I remember always saying to her, feels like self-will. Seems like I'm trying to force this new type of recovery into my existing, and it doesn't quite fit. And it feels like I just want to go back to the third step and turn my will and my life, back over to a higher power. And so kind of did that for a long time and tried some different programs and some different things, and kind of always felt like there was a friend of mine, John S. And John and I, before I got married, we went through the big book, and we said, let's go back and kind of see if we can get, that other, he called it the other 20%. Hey, we got the first 80% the first few times we went through the steps. Let's get that other 20% that we missed. And so we went through, this is, in time of AA, the big book. And I went through that, and it helped a little bit, but I still continue to sort of feel that need for something more. Something wasn't quite right there. Something was missing inside. And so I went on like that for some time, and then kind of just was sober, not drinking, doing the same kind of thing, still kind of knowing that I'm sort of sounding better than I maybe feel, but I'm trying, and I'm working 6 and 7 the best I can. And and then through a series of events, during the 2016, my wife came down with breast cancer, and she got through it okay with minimal treatment, but then it came back in 2019. It metastasized to her liver, and in June of 2020 she passed away, and it was the height of the pandemic. And we were living here in this house by ourselves, and it was all of a sudden life just was turned upside down, and in a way that I didn't really know was possible. And I only knew how to grieve by having had watching other people in the program go through grief, they would bring it out to meetings, they would talk about it, they would, go to these outside grief groups, they would be able to have services for their, significant other who passed away in a public place, and they would go out and meet people. And for me, I had always thought if anything like that ever happened to me, I would just go to a ton of meetings, and I would work out and go out to the gym, and all these things that I had seen people do and thought that I would do if that ever happened to me were not available. And so I had to figure out kind of a different way to do this. And so I, started to, it created this new form of humility that I hadn't had since I got, came into A and hit bottom. And this new form of humility was basically that, I have no idea, God, what to do, or higher power, whatever term you want to use. I like higher power, but I use God to, I don't know what to do here. I have no idea. Just show me, just tell me what to do. Show me what literally the next right thing is, like the next 5 minutes, like help me to breathe, help me to just, I mean, there were times when I was just like on the floor, and, just help me to get up off the floor and do something. And so the way that I got through that was I found, there were no meetings in person that I knew of. So I, found an online meeting that met out of the area where I got sober. And it occurred to me one day, and I believe this was all higher power driven, that there, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use this opportunity in this pandemic to, because Zoom is available to connect with, the people that I got sober. I spent my first 14 years of sobriety in New Jersey. And I'm going to connect with those people, and I'm going to, and kind of use it that way, because I miss those meetings and I miss those folks. And I found a meeting that met every night at 10 Eastern. It was 7 p.m. here, which was perfect. And I believe that my higher power sent other angels as well. Those people helped me tremendously. I talked about it in the meeting all the time. I found someone back east who had gone through a very similar thing, and she and I would spend an hour on the phone every day talking it through. My wife had worked at a church, and for the last year of her life, and that church was instrumental in helping me to sort of get through some things. Put together an online service for her, an online funeral or service memorial for her. And they offered me grief groups, and I did counseling, and it was all on Zoom, all of it. So it was kind of crazy. And I was sort of alone, and I was alone in the house this whole time. So there was a lot of reliance on that higher power. And all of a sudden, this new form of humility took place, or really the original humility that I had when I hit bottom sort of came back. And through a set of circumstances, I ended up getting together, and we were sitting in a restaurant one day. And I think I was reading something from the literature, and she started reading me some literature that I'd never heard. And I said, "Oh, that's really cool. Like, that's what I've been looking for. What is that?" And she said, "Well, that's CoDA literature, And I think she was reading from the patterns and characteristics in recovery. And I thought, "Oh, that's cool. They give the opposites, and that's kind of what I've been looking for and what I'm about, and what I like to kind of I really like to get into that and learn more about it." And so I went to a few CoDA meetings, and particularly this one Thursday night meeting that there's some folks from there today. They're here from that meeting today. And at first I didn't identify. I thought everybody was talking about struggling in relationships, and I thought, for me, I in my previous recovery, I'd worked hard at that. And for whatever reason, I had ended up in some really good relationships, a great marriage. I had great friendships, and so I thought maybe I don't belong here. And, and then one night, and I were out with another couple, and, she said, "Hey, why don't you talk to this gentleman here?" And he's here today. And he said to me, "It's not about your relationship with other people. It's really about the relationship with yourself." And that was the bell went off, like, "Oh, okay, it's about the relationship with myself." That I can get on board with, because that's not so great. I've been working on how to treat other people. I've been working on, how can I, be a good person kind of stuff, but I've never really been able to sort of tackle this other aspect that I've been referring to, and so we started to get together. He became my sponsor, and sort of took a deeper dive into these character defects. And that's, Jackie mentioned in the introduction that kind of how, and I talk about it, how sort of CoDA began to and continues to round off my sobriety, right? My recovery, and now they become one. But there are some differences that I've been able to bring into my recovery from CoDA, right? And and they're the way that I look at these defects, and this is sort of the start into 6 and 7, in that, what used to be termed for me as an example is that I looked at everything as pride and ego, because that's how I was brought up in AA, was that, it's your pride, it's your ego, and that's the problem. So you need to have humility in your life, which isn't a bad thing, and it's not necessarily wrong. I mean, I use that and I would pray for humility. And, it worked to some extent, right? But, I started to learn in CoDA that it's really more of an issue. I'm always looking for that sort of lowest level common denominator. What is the bottom line character defect because I want to know what it is specifically so that I can give it to a higher power. I want to know, what is that thing? What is in my way? What is blocking the sunlight of spirit? What's in the way of my relationship with my higher power? And so we started to talk about that. And I started to realize in CoDA that it's really about my comfort level with myself. It's really about how my self-esteem is and where my self-esteem is. And so the prayers kind of changed to, praying for humility, which I still think is huge. I plan on talking about it as a big part of the step work, but it's also more so for me now about developing a comfort level with myself. We also started to look at, I had looked at fear, right? So I'm in fear, and my 10th step was all about going back and looking at, where's the fear here, because that was a big part and continues to be a big part of my inventory. And it changed a little bit. So I'd call my sponsor, my new sponsor, and he would say, and I would say, well, I'm in fear. And, usually in the past, it would be like, okay, well, let's, ask God to remove the fear, or, whatever the suggestion might be. And instead, he would say, well, fear of what? And that was kind of new for me. Oh, fear of what? Well, fear of that A, B, and C. And then he would sort of jump in and say, so you're worried about, what people think of you, and, what he terms impression management, right? And so, that I'm so worried about impression management that I'm trying to, impress other people, that I'm worried about how I'm coming across, right? And so that became very important as well, to kind of drill down into these character defects and kind of find out what's really going on here. And the other thing that I found myself doing a lot that I never really knew I was doing, I mean, I kind of did. In all these areas, I kind of knew I was doing it. And sometimes I would say it to other sponsees, et cetera. But I didn't kind of realize it to the extent, and I didn't know there was a whole program built for it. That I was, comparing myself to other people, right? And so I would look at other people and say, God, I wish, instead of looking at my own strengths and what I was capable of, I was always looking to others. And I still struggle with this, because you're never better, you're never fixed. But I would look to other people and say, I wish I kind of had what they had. And I'll give you some examples, right? So I'm big into weightlifting, right? So, but I'm an older guy now, and I only weigh, 100 and whatever pounds, right? And I go into the gym, there's a guy in there 250 pounds, and he's like 30 years old or 20 years old. And I'm like, why can't I lift as much as that guy? Why is he lifting more weight than me, right? I did that for years. I was trying to keep up, right? And I'm lifting heavy, trying to keep up with, the 20-year-old who weighs 250 pounds. Doesn't really, that's not really the best way to go, right? What are my motivations for doing that? What are the underlying character defects? I'm comparing myself because I don't feel esteemable. I don't have the self-esteem that I need to say, I am here to work out and feel good about myself and be healthy. Who cares what, who cares what that guy over there is doing, right? Or when I grew up, as I mentioned, looks was a big deal. So I would look at other people. God, I wish I was as good looking as that guy. Then I would be okay. Then I would be fixed, and life would be good, right? If I just look like that, and I would pick the best looking people, right? I got to look like, if I just look like Clooney, if I just look Brad Pitt, I would be set. My life would be good, right? Everything would be just fine. And and I can do that in all different areas. And I particularly, have to really be careful at work. I mentioned that I work in the field. I work in the IT field, and there's a lot of really smart people. And when I first got into it, it was a shocker. I switched careers. I got into it, and it was a shocker. Like, wow, there are some bright people in the field, and I just don't have what they have. And and the need to feel like, if God, I wish I was as smart as, but they're like, that guy can just code circles around me. That guy can write code, on the fly and in front of people. And I got to kind of sit back and figure it out and look at it, right? And it's really easy for me to do that. And all of these things come down to the same thing. And we'll get into some more, specific characteristics after the break. But they all for me come down to the same thing, that self-esteem, getting more comfortable with self and trying to really get my self-worth. And this is what I've learned in CoDA and from my sponsor, to get my worthiness and my value from other things outside, right? Instead of getting it from my higher power and looking at the things that I do well. For example, I'll call my sponsor and I'll say, well, I need to be able to do this better. And he'll say, you're a really good guy. Like, that's and I'm like, that's not really enough. Like, being a good guy, that when I was growing up, being a good guy equates to being a loser. Like, those are the people that didn't get the women, like being a good guy, like that's an insult, but he really means it. Like, you are a good guy, like people like you. He'll say, I don't know anybody that doesn't like you. I'm thinking, that's great, but but I'm not as smart as this guy, and I can't lift as much as that guy. So, who cares, but that's, what codependency is for me. And that's how it looks for me. And recently I've learned a couple of other things that I never knew. And so, and I'm a couple of years into CoDA, and, so this stuff's fairly new to me, even though I've got this history of sobriety and recovery in AA. And I kind of put it all together, but some of the things that I'm learning now are different. And, I had a conversation, and when you talk to two different people in the same week and you bring the same issue and they say the same thing, that maybe you need to pay attention and listen. And so that's what happened. So recently I went to my sponsor and I said, hey, I got this thing going on. And, thinking that I know what he's going to say, I think I know where he's going to go. And instead he doesn't. And he pivots and he says, do you ever allow yourself to make mistakes? And I said, no. And he said, do you allow yourself to be human? And no, I didn't even know that you could do that. Like, I thought you had to go through life being perfect. I thought that you had to always get it right. And I got to know what the next move is. And I got to get it right. And I got to get it perfect. Otherwise I'm a failure, which sounds extreme, but that's, kind of how I've lived, to some extent, not really realizing it. And so I went to someone else, not to get another opinion, but just because I was talking to someone else. And so I brought the situation to her. And I said, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And she said, well, where are you at in, allowing yourself to make mistakes? And I thought, oh my God, are you serious? Like that, I just got asked that recently. I don't really do that. And she kind of looked at me like, really? You don't ever allow, like, or how about, can it just be good enough? Can something be good enough? And I said, I don't really understand what good enough means. Like, and she kind of looked at me like I'm nuts. And she said, well, like, just, it's good enough. And I did the best you could. I said, that does not ever ring true for me. The best I can means that I work 24 hours a day. It's like this workshop. I'm going to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until the minute the workshop starts. I got to go on at 12:15. And 12:30, then I stopped working on it. That means I did the best I could. And she's looking at me like I'm nuts, like, you have to kind of ease up here and allow yourself to be human, right? And so that's a new concept for me, right? And these are the new concepts I'm learning CoDA, and these are the things that I'm starting to bring into 6 and 7. right? These are the things that I'm starting to look at in steps 6 and 7. So before we go any further, we have about 15 minutes left before the break. So I want to open it up to you guys and maybe hear a little bit about, some of the things that you've picked up so far, maybe there's some of the areas that you get into trouble, and then we'll go ahead and break at 1:30. So when we'll come back, we'll get specifically into 6 and 7 and how I work them in my life, and hopefully offer you some ways to go about it as well. And then at the end of that, we'll open it up for sharing, and we'll start with you guys. For any good 6 and 7 discussion, it just wouldn't be the same without having a good list of character defects. And I use that term character defects kind of loosely. I mean, everybody has a different way that they talk about these. That's just a term that I've gotten used to over the years, but whatever term works for you, that's what really counts, is that whatever term feels good for you. But I will use those terms today. And if you have other ones, please feel free. So I went, being a good CoDA member and trying to stay with the CoDA literature, I went to the CoDA Green Book, our workbook, and pulled out almost all the defects listed possibilities. There might have been a couple more, but in my perfectionism, I wanted to have my boxes nice and neat here. So I maybe pulled a couple out that weren't as applicable. So I'm going to go ahead and just read these from left to right and then down, and just kind of give you an idea of kind of some of the things that we're looking at. I believe that we need a really good list here. So procrastination, belief that we are in control, fear of letting go and trusting, fear of what others think or may feel about us, fear of others' anger, dishonesty, manipulation, self-abuse, reacting other than acting, our need to be right, our inability to ask for help, our desire for others to do it our way, perfectionism, guilt, shame, addictions, resentment, self-righteousness, isolation, and self-abandonment. And so here we have a lot to work with, and I'm of the belief that the more I kind of have to work with, and the more specific I get, the better off I'm going to be. And the ones that I personally identify, some of these that I've spoken about are, fear of letting go and trusting, because I learned that I needed to worry about things, bless you, fear of what others may feel or think about me, the perfectionism, the guilt, the shame. And then there's one in the bottom right-hand corner that I never knew about until I got to CoDA, this idea of self-abandonment, right? And then I learned, and I heard my sponsor use this term, self-abandonment. Wow, never thought about that, that when I would, when I'm people pleasing, when I'm worried about what other people think of me, that causes me to abandon my values, what I believe, what maybe I want to do, what I'm interested in, right? In so many different ways. And then when I self-abandon, all of a sudden I get a resentment, and the resentment is with me because I've self-abandoned. So a lot of my resentments, and I've always said this to guys over the years in recovery, that a lot of times I'm mad at myself, when I'm resentful because I didn't speak up, something like that. But I never really equated it with self-abandonment until I, first heard that term in CoDA. So I really identify with that. And I think having this list really helps me to narrow it down. So it's, I have to have the right tool for the right job. So if I'm, I'm not very good with cars, but if I was, and I was trying to fix my own car, and I was trying to use a wrench when I needed a screwdriver, it's probably I'm not going to be driving that thing anytime soon. So I really need to know what's at the root that I want to give to God. Because if I give him the wrong thing, or I ask for some new thing that's maybe not correct, then I'm not really getting, I might not get the results that I'm looking for. So before we start, I was thinking that, in your muted state, we could all sort of say the step 6 prayer together. Please join me if you wish. In this moment, I am entirely ready to be freed of all my shortcomings. In this moment, I am ready to surrender these defects of character to God knowing that the power of willingness to heal is great. Each new step I take in my recovery, no matter how small it may appear, is an affirmation of my wholeness. And so this step not only is this prayer rather is not only a beautiful prayer, but it reminds me that, there's been a lot of talk already about perfectionism. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to get my recovery is not going to be perfect. My step 6 is not going to be perfect, right? It's a little bit at a time. It's doing the best I can. Maybe it's just noticing something that has improved, right, over time. And so step 6 for me, it took me a while to kind of realize that. And step 6 is we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And it's important because this one really can get missed very easily. And I used to skip over it and go right to 7. I used to actually say to people, I know I'm ready. I'm just going to go ask for it, right? But what I found out after a little bit of time in doing this and trying it was that, there might be some things that are holding me back from being ready or holding me back from being willing. And, I need to pray for willingness, but I also kind of need to know, is there anything holding me back in my 6th step on any of these character defects or all of them, right? And what I found is that there is a payoff for everything that I'm doing. Now, it might not be a good payoff, but there is some kind of reward. There is some kind of payoff. Now, a lot of these things have, come over time. Maybe I used them as a kid and to protect myself in some way, shape, or form. And maybe they work now and they don't work. They work then and they don't work now. Or maybe there's just some natural instinct that I'm kicking up to the next level, right? And it's causing me problems. In other words, I learned to be prideful about my achievements, but am I taking pride to that next level? Am I becoming egotistical? Am I starting to take things personally if I don't like the way something's happening, right? And so I can kick those up to the next level. But also there's typically some kind of payoff, right? And here they are, right? So sometimes it's easier to sit in today's pain. So, sometimes for me, I don't know about any of you guys, but it can still feel good to kind of live in pain, because I'm used to that place and it's home. It can be home sometimes, right? I can go back to that place where it just feels good to sit in some pain right now, and I know for me, for example, when I'm angry, right? When I'm angry, there is a big payoff to being angry because all of a sudden, any fear that I was feeling is gone. Everything that I'm thinking is justified, right? And so there's that payoff of being sitting in that anger, right? And then the other pieces of this are, that might be holding me back is, questions on my mind about what this is going to look like if I really, give these over to a higher power or give these over to God. How will I get what I want? Like what are things going to look like? How will I, if I have to be honest in my life, how am I going to get what I want if I can't have just a little bit of enough dishonesty to kind of get what I want, right? Or how will I make a living if I have to be honest or authentic, or who will take care of me, right? Maybe I've been taught to do it all myself, right? I sort of, got to be independent, got to do things myself, that maybe doesn't feel right for me to just do this complete surrender to a higher power and have God remove all these defects of character. Sometimes, I might feel that God is not powerful enough. Like, man, this thing keeps showing back up, just keeps reoccurring. Maybe God can't do it, and so maybe I need to go back and make my God bigger, and I've had to go back in recovery with my sponsor, after my wife passed away and my beliefs changed about, why things happen for a reason and, nothing happens in God's world by mistake. How does that all work? And I had to go back and change kind of my view of my higher power and that relationship. And the other thing that I've had to do is make my God bigger and bigger and know that and trust that he is big enough to do this job. He really is. But the problem is that I can run into is I can limit him by thinking that he's me. In other words, like putting my limitations onto my higher power gets me in trouble. And then all of a sudden, step 6 gets a lot harder because I'm blocked. Right. Well, God can't do it because of A, B, C, and D. But those A, B, C, and D are my limitations, they're human limitations, and I have to remember that, my higher power is all powerful and can do for me what I can't do for myself, right? And the other thing that I had to go back and look at, and what might be blocking my sixth step is, you know, I am my character defects. In other words, they are so ingrained that they start to feel like me, right? Those are me, and I forget that they're separate. I forget. And my sponsor has a couple of nice sayings about this. He says that, I don't have to be defined by my fifth step. And he says that it's also not, changing who I am, but it's getting rid of who I'm not. And, for the sake of this discussion, I would say, even letting go of who I'm not, right? And just being who I am authentically, hence the title of this discussion. And so it's important to me to separate. The other thing that he likes to say is that, it's not that I'm a fearful person, right? Because I walked around with that for years, even in recovery. And I would say, I have anxiety, or I'm a person of fear, or I'm a fearful guy trying to get better, or whatever, however I would say it. But, the way he says it is fear is upon me, right? So something is upon me. It means it's separate. And in meditation, that's actually one of the main practices of meditation. One of the things that we're taught in meditation is to kind of separate from that, right? To kind of step back from ourselves and have an objective view of ourselves. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, is saying that these things are separate, and all they really are these things that I've learned to protect myself, things that have happened in my life that I've developed to, or instincts that have been kicked up to the next level. So they're not who I am, but they're upon me at times. And if I can sort of step back from them, then I feel like, okay, well, if that's the case and I'm separate from them, this higher power I can surrender them to a higher power. I think, he'll be able to do it, right? And that whole, what will become of me, right? I'll look like the hole in the donut, right? There'll be nothing left, there's, what I'm afraid, what if higher power has this in mind? What if he's got this in mind? Like what? But the bottom line is, if there's a plan for me, that plan is going to happen either way. It doesn't matter. So I might as well roll with it, and I might as well allow him to do his will. But also, I want to try to come at this not from the place of that, oh my God, I have to accept, sometimes you hear in meetings, like, I just have to accept the way things are, almost like, this sucks. And to me, I don't want to look at it that way. I want to be excited about when I wake up in the morning and I pray and meditate. I do every day. I have for years. I want to be excited about, yeah, show me what you got in store for me today. Not just, I just have to accept what happens, but I want to be excited about what will become of me, because I believe, I want to believe that my higher power has my best interests in mind. So whatever he's got in store, however it looks, even if it doesn't look the way I think it should look, it's still for my best interest. So I want to be excited about that. Earlier, I talked about, that I needed to worry, that it's responsible to worry. So the biggest one for me that I kind of noticed when I was pulling these apart and trying to figure out what's blocking my sixth step is I realized through some meditation and asking for guidance that, it's irresponsible for me to let go. If my job is to worry and stay on top of everything and not let anything get behind me, then I really need to worry. And this is irresponsible. And that, is something that I prayed about and came to me. And that's probably the biggest blocker of my sixth step. I have to go back and remember that it is not irresponsible to let go. And I've been, hearing about this stuff for years in recovery, right? Letting go, everything in the steps goes against this belief. And yet I still had it, and didn't really know it was there. And then the last one is, that I built this image, right? I've got this social mask. I've got people seeing me the way I want them to see me, whether it's, whatever way that I think, gives me value, right? How can I sort of tear all that down and be happy, right? If I ask for God's will, I got to give up that social mask. I got to let it go. And so these are the ways that, my sixth step can be blocked. And these are the things that can hold me back. And these are some of the payoffs and some of the belief systems that can get in my way. So in continuing or beginning on step 6, what are the actions, right? So we talked about, people were able to identify at the end of the first section that, identify with that, what do I do about it? And somebody even said, and I think it was Steve that said, I can't fix it myself, right? And for that, that's a big one. Years ago, probably 30 years ago, I heard a guy say, and he had been sober probably about 30 years, and he said that, you can't fix the problem with the problem. And the problem is me. I created the problem. I am not going to fix it. I am not going to get myself out of the problem. So I need to recognize that, and remember that I'm not going to do this headlong assault and be able to conquer this thing and self-will this thing into submission. Like, I really need to step back and begin to surrender. And what I try to do is recognize what the payoff is. What am I getting out of this? And if I can recognize what that payoff is, that helps me to move forward in step 6 and do that surrender, right? And the step also asks us to pray for willingness, right? If I don't feel ready, pray for willingness. And praying for willingness for me is looking at that stuff, right? Am I willing? Am I not willing, and why? And just by asking that, I'm working the 6th step, right? Because I'm investigating as to why maybe I'm not willing. And so that's really important for me. I want to talk a little bit about, in 6 and 7, one of the most important concepts for me is humility. And I talked about it earlier when I had some of the difficult times a few years back, and kind of that brought back that level of humility that I've tried to bring forward in my recovery. And I used to look at humility as a bad thing for a long time, because I thought humility equaled humiliation. That I thought that, that makes me a bad person, that I'm humiliated, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed. And those are the words that used to come up for me with humility. And then I learned that humility is actually a really good thing. It can give me serenity. And then it's the building of character. And that I had a sponsor that told me early on in my recovery that you don't have to be backed into a corner to have humility. Now, that's not to say that I'm always perfect with this, and that I'm not. A lot of times I get into pain, and that's how I end up looking at these things and going back into 6 and 7 through my 10th step. But I can actually practice character building and humility in my own life before these things come up, and that's a big part as we move into 7 that we'll talk about as well, is sort of moving into a life of character building, right? And humility, and that humility as something that I really want versus humility as something that I have or be forced into, right? And so in meetings, you may have heard of cleansing, and I put these together, cleansing and rituals. And one of the things, I like to keep a pretty clean house. And, there's a speaker that I really like, and she says that, if you want to create anything in your life, go clean the garage, clean a closet, right? I need to create space. I need to have some kind of ritualistic process that I am ready for this. I'm moving into step 6, and maybe that's a retreat or a day alone. A lot of people you hear in meetings talking about having a God box, right? Some people they create cards to carry around with a character defect on each one, and they're flipping it over during the day or in the morning. And I also am a big proponent of candles. So the way I do it is every day I meditate and I create a flyer. So I close the blinds and I light a candle and I bring readings out, and it's ritualistic for me. It's a way to create this cleansing. It's basically saying that I am now starting the process right now in this moment. Higher power, I'm reaching out to you. I'm going to listen to what you have to say, and I'll even break up my meditations. I'll do a step, first half step 6, first cup of coffee is step 6, second cup of coffee, second half is step 7. And to literally say, this is what I'm working on right now. And there's a lot of different ways, but to have some kind of ritual and to have some kind of process to kind of make a statement to the universe, with your higher power, that I am ready. We're entirely ready. I am now ready to do this. I am ready to surrender to you and to your will, right? And as I've said, popular ways for me, for me, I wouldn't be able to do it any other way, is through prayer and meditation, right? So when I'm praying, I'm asking, I'm doing that surrender. I'm saying prayers. I'm asking to be ready. I'm praying for willingness. And then when I meditate, I'm kind of listening. I'm asking for the answer. What's the answer? What should I do about this higher power? What are these, what are the opposites, right? And we'll talk about that in 7. What are the opposites of these character defects? What do you want me to do today to move away from and into the person that I want to be, which is, and this goes right into the last line in this slide, is, I want to act as if I'm already willing, right? And say, you know what, I am ready. I am ready, higher power, and to use affirmations. Now, a lot of times, I'm a big proponent of affirmations. A lot of times, for a lot of people, they feel fake. And I wanted to address that, right? You're saying these things, it's like, but I don't believe it. And I want to address that very specifically as they relate to 6 and 7, in that, if I want to move into a place of, where and again, going back to what my sponsor said, it's not about changing who we are, it's getting rid of who we're not or asking to become who we already are, right? So I don't believe that I was put here to live in worry. I don't believe that I was put here to just be stubborn or worry or live in a world of shame and guilt. That was I put. Does God want that for me? I don't think so. So if I'm trying to do something and act as if that I want to move away from that, is that really fake? For me, it's not fake at all. It's actually, all I'm saying to higher power is I want to be my authentic self. So when I use an affirmation to become my authentic self, it's not fake. Now, it might feel that way because I've been living in this world of guilt and shame and whatever other character defects. But if I start to use an affirmation to move in that direction, to me, that's not fake. It's actually very authentic. So I wanted to try to address that because I know a lot of people have said that to me as I talk about affirmations. And, oh man, I feel so funny. I look in the mirror and I say these things and I don't believe them. And the other thing that I found is the more I do them, the more they come true. And the more I start to believe them, because as soon as I see some, if I see some result that I'm looking for and I feel better in some way, all of a sudden I get this momentum. And I build that momentum, and affirmations become an incredibly powerful tool for me. So I use them a lot, and I use them when I pray and meditate. I mean, I use them throughout the day, but in the morning it's particularly powerful because I've just woken up. I don't turn on any TV, I don't, not my phone, anything. It's the first thing that I do after I get the cup of coffee, so that I am totally open to it. And those affirmations can be really powerful in those, in that early morning, in those moments, but also to use them throughout the day as I continue to try to connect for that humility with my higher power. So that's step 6. Before we move into step 7, I thought we'd do the step 7 prayer. Okay, would you want to join me, and anyone else in your muted state? In this moment, I ask my higher power to remove all my shortcomings, relieving me of the burden of my past. In this moment, I place my hand in God's, trusting that the void I experience is being filled with my higher power's unconditional love for me and those in my life. Beautiful prayer. All right, so a good step 7 discussion for me has to include humility, and we've already really hit upon it. But I wanted to even hit upon a little bit more. There's a lot of definitions, and there's a lot of confusion, I think, around humility and what it means, right? And so I just kind of jotted down some of the definitions that we hear in the room, some of the definitions that we've heard elsewhere, right? So being right, and I'm not saying that these are right or wrong. This is just some of the things that we hear. Being right size, a clear recognition of who we are and what we would like to become, being grateful for what I have, being, I'm supposed to say being hard on myself. There's my perfection. There's my blunder, right? Being hard on myself, or what I was starting to say, it looks like there was beating myself up, right? And that's a big one, right? Because a lot of times that can be, under the guise of humility, as my sponsor says, that, I can, sometimes I'll be in meetings and, in other 12-step programs, and, I'll hear a speaker who says something to the effect of, I called my sponsor and I was whining and complaining, and he hung up on me because I was being so whiny, and everybody starts clapping, right? How wonderful, you're so humble, right? And so for me, that's not humility. That's, but a lot of times it gets confused for humility, right? It's also another definition we hear is acceptance of ourselves. The other one that I don't have listed here that I kind of want to not necessarily debunk, but one thing that I'm not real big on is, the idea that if I say I have humility, I don't. I hear that all the time in meetings, right? And sometimes I'll be in a meeting and the topic is humility, and nobody will say a word. Nobody wants to share because they think if I say anything about humility, it means I don't have it. They're afraid to share. And so, for me, it's not that. I think it's okay for me to say I'm feeling humble or I have humility in the moment, right? I don't think that. So all these definitions, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. And I've heard people say, humility is, putting the cart back at the grocery store. And that, I think that's a good act of character. I mean, that's good for character building. Is it humility? I don't know. I mean, I don't say how long I'm sober in meetings unless I'm speaking or I'm celebrating each year, but is that humility? I just kind of do it as to try to be humble, but I don't know if it's actually humility. It's something that I'm doing to try to build character, right? But the one that I love, and this is just the one that works for me, is the one that's in bold here at the bottom. And it fits right into our seventh step, is a sincere desire supposed to say seek and do God's will, right? A sincere desire to seek and do God's will, and the building of character, right? So the reason for me that works so well with the seventh step is the minute that I ask for help, the minute that I ask for these defects to be removed, or this specific character defect to be removed, I believe I am in humility, because suddenly I'm not in self-will anymore. I'm surrendering. I'm talking to God. I'm asking for help. I am not in any of those other character defects. I mean, I might still be feeling the effects of them, but I'm moving into a place of humility. And so humility for me is sort of at the core of the seventh step. And this other idea of character building, that, the building of character is something that I can continue to work toward, instead of, earlier I was talking about that we get very hung up on what people are thinking of me, that I'm not strong enough, I'm not good looking enough, I'm not whatever, I'm not smart enough, right? And instead of looking at the outside world to get my self-worth, I focus on character building, and also focus on, what I learned in CoDA is to look at the things that I am good at, and to ask my higher power. One of my prayers is I ask my higher power for me to see myself the way he sees me, and to set aside everything that I know about who I am, and to be able to see myself as he sees me. And that's really an important part of my seventh step. So some other actions. So prayers, right? And in my prayers, I need to take the opposite action, or ask to have the opposite thing in my life, and take the opposite action, really. And I'll get into that in the next slide. But for example, right? So if I'm, having trouble with, we talked about self-esteem stuff. We've been talking a lot about low self-esteem, or caring what other people think of me. I want to try to figure out what the opposite of that is, right? And so a lot of times I'm praying for humility, or I'm praying for self-esteem, or I'm praying for character, and really focus on whatever the opposite of that is. Or, being imperfect, right? That's an opposite, I think, too. For allow me to be imperfect, allow me to allow myself to be imperfect, and focusing on the opposites. And on the CoDA.org site, we hear it read in the meetings, the patterns and characteristics. But in addition to patterns and characteristics, on the CoDA site, CoDA.org, there's actually patterns and characteristics in recovery that I referred to earlier that he was reading to me. And those have the opposites, and that's exactly what that is, right? So I can download that, and I actually have it, and I'll use it in my meditation and look at, it'll list the pattern and characteristic, but then on the other side of the table, it'll say, it'll list some opposite affirmation. So these affirmations and opposites are the way out for me. And 6 and 7 are the way up and out for me. And they're right in the middle of 12 steps, right? So to me, it's a chain. And I don't want to break the chain. The minute I pull out 6 and 7, the chain breaks of the 12 steps. And so that's how I think of it. So it's really important. And in addition to affirmations and how I'm talking to myself, I really want to act as if. I really want to act as if, you know what, I am this person because I am. Because my higher power put me here to be this person, not that person, not those character defects, not those things. And so I want to become that person, and not even as much as acting is even becoming that person. And sort of moving into that person that I was really put here to be. The other thing I want to do is try to align myself to be in accordance with these principles, right? So if I want to be that person that I believe I'm put here to be, I have to try to act in alignment with that. So when I do that stuff, so as I act as I try to put myself into that place, I try to align myself. And anytime I start to do something or say something out of alignment, I feel it. And so I try to get back into alignment with whatever that is. We talked a lot about affirmations and continuing to use those in step 6, but also in step 7, right? And find those opposites that work as affirmations. And lastly, on this slide, I talked about step 10, and so the way that I work this stuff is that, because for years, I kind of didn't know where should I be, what step should I be on, should I be on this step, should I be on 3, should I be on 6, should I be on 11? And today I try to just stay in 10, 11, 12, and that keeps it simple for me. But to further explain that, 10 being 4 through 9, right? 10 being 4 through 9, that, when I start to notice something is off, I immediately go back, try to identify what that defect is from that list that I gave, or whatever list came from my 5th step, figure out what it is in 4, talk to somebody about it in 5. For me, a lot of times it's a call to my sponsor to talk it through, and he'll tell me, hey, you're just seeing things, that are off, you're in this defect. He'll say things like, you've got this filter, this narrative that's telling you, it's looking for things that you're doing wrong. So anything that you can find to pull that in, that narrative is just looking for those things. So we have to try to undo that narrative, right? And so 5, I'm turning it over, I'm talking to him about it. And then we get to 6 and 7, right? Within that 10th step, to try to develop that attitude of, acceptance, that of surrender, rather, that, I'm now willing to give this to a higher power. And then in 7, actually giving it and turning it over to that higher power. And then obviously, 4 through 9 includes 8 and 9. So if I made a mistake, if I owe an amends, to make an amends. Now, as I said, a lot of times it's not the blatant stuff for me. It's not those big things that got taken care of when I first came into recovery. It's the smaller things, right? Like, I'm not stealing anymore, but and I'm not dishonest in that way, but maybe there's different levels of honesty based on how I want to appear to the outer world, right? So that kind of thing. I'm not necessarily hurting anyone, but I'm still feeling certain ways that don't feel good. And those things, these character defects, block off the sunlight of the spirit. They block my relationship with my higher power. And so this is kind of how I do it. And I talked about praying for the opposite and acting on it. And for me, I started to create this little card with different attributes or opposites that I wanted to embody, that I wanted to become. And it's an affirmation, but it's a little bit more than that. It's also really kind of acting as if we're being / becoming that person, right? And so what works for me is to kind of move into that space of, this is why I'm here. This is what God put me here on this earth to be. I am a man of self-esteem. I am a man of self-respect, of integrity, of reality, right? Because a lot of times I'm not seeing things, and when I'm in those character defects, I'm not seeing things in a real way. I am a man of authenticity. I'm a man of character. We talked about character building. I'm a man that has a healthy perspective, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with reality, right? I have a healthy perspective. I see things in a way, I'm not feeding that narrative anymore, that I see things from a healthy perspective. Optimism is a big one for me, because I can go pretty negative, and I can go all the way down the road of, what, this workshop's going to be horrible and nobody's going to like it, and everybody will drop off before I'm done, and then my life will be horrible and no one will ever like me again, right? I can go all the way, I'll take it all the way down the tube, right? So I have to remember that, I'm a man of optimism, and that's an opposite, right? It helps me, what, no, things are going to be great. And even if this doesn't go well, and even if I make mistakes, I'll be okay. I like myself, right? And a man of faith. I always hear people say I'm a man of God. I'm like, I always wanted to be the man of God, but I can be, I am, right? I'm a man of faith. I practice spirituality in my life. I'm a man of gratitude. And when I'm grateful for things, and that's where my focus is really important. Am I focusing on the objects of my existence and how I'm appearing to people, or am I focusing on my higher power within? Am I grateful for what I have? I'll call my sponsor. He'll say, you have all these good things and these good attributes, and you're focusing on this other thing over here that means nothing, right? And I'm a man of hope. I'm a man of surrender, which is kind of a new word in my vocabulary, not something that I used to use before, but I like that. There was a guy, that same guy that I quoted earlier, say that, I said I surrender 100 times a day, surrendering. So 6 and 7 are both an act of surrender. And finally, a man of trust, that I trust the process. I trust my higher power. So those are really important for me. And I'll end with this story, um, of something that happened yesterday. So, and how these things kind of come up for me. Jackie and I were sitting here, we are playing this game, right? And it was testing my logistical skill. And I had never played it, and she played it, and she's really good at that kind of stuff, and she's great at this game. And I'm just getting frustrated with myself, and I'm just starting to beat on myself that why am I so stupid? I work in IT, I should be able to figure this stuff out. I'm just beating myself up. And finally we stopped, and I had to like literally take a break and call my sponsor, and he had to say like, this doesn't mean anything. Like, this is a game. This has nothing. I'm down the road of like, I don't know if I can do this workshop tomorrow. I don't think I'm smart enough to handle this workshop, right? Because I can't figure out this game, this logistical game, this little game of trying to figure out, what colors you have over there that you're hiding from me. But that's how this stuff sort of shows up in my life. And that's why it's important for me to continue to kind of live this process on a regular basis. And so I went back through, my inventory and kind of did an inventory on it and called my sponsor, and that's how these things work for me.